So I just finished sewing up this dress over the weekend. It's got a great Halloween print on it. As soon as I saw it at the craft store, I knew I wanted to make it into a dress, and I decided to use a vintage Vogue 1950s pattern. I filmed the whole process so that I could share it with you, so you could see all of my mess ups, all of my hiccups, all of the things that I did wrong, so that when you decide to start stitching, or if you already do, you can learn from my mistakes. But first, let's take in the dress, shall we? She's got a fitted bodice and a flared skirt. Now, don't be fooled, there is a can underneath, and there's also pockets. The back has a zipper, and that's all there is to it. So let me share with you how I went about making this dress.
Let's first talk fabric. I'm using something called quilter's cotton, which is traditionally used for, you guessed it, quilts. But I like using it for dresses because it always comes in a ton of variety of prints. I always buy about 3 yards of fabric when it comes to making a dress that's fit and flared like what I'm wearing. And I always wash, dry, and iron my fabric before starting any project. When you're sewing, you need to use a pattern. When it comes to a pattern, you want to look for a couple of things. Check for the size. You can see it here in the upper right-hand corner, but don't be fooled if that size doesn't match the size that you normally wear when you go to the clothing store. Let's take a look at the back of the pattern envelope because there's a ton of information there. Using a tape measure, you'll probably want to find out the measurements for your bust, your waist, and your hips to know what size you are. Now, vintage patterns, they only had one size per pattern envelope, but modern patterns, you'll find a wide variety of sizes for just one envelope. What I'm always looking for on the back of these envelopes is how much work I'm going to have to do. If you take a look at that little diagram on the left-hand side, it's showing you that all I have to do is cut out that one shape at the top for the bust or the bodice or the top of the dress, and then that long rectangle for the bottom. Pattern envelopes often tell you what kind of fabric they recommend, as well as any other supplies you might need to make the dress. The first order of business after the fabric has been washed, dried, and ironed is to cut out the pattern pieces. To do that, you'll want to flip the fabric over to what's called the wrong side. Now, I made a pretty big mistake right here. This print that I bought is full of different kinds of images and imagery. And for that reason, I really should have thought hard about where I was going to place the pattern pieces to know where it would fall on my dress. Instead, I just pinned my pattern pieces down and started cutting without thinking about that. Thankfully, all patterns come with written and illustrated directions, which if you're a visual learner like me, it helps out tremendously. Pattern pieces are usually on really thin tissue paper, and they also usually have quite a bit of information on them. This vintage Vogue pattern, though, it ain't giving you nothing. You're on your own. And since I've used this pattern quite a bit, the tissue paper is really starting to tear. So I took some time to tape it back together again before pinning it and cutting it out. Now, this pattern required that I fold the fabric in half, which is the left-hand side, and pin the pattern piece vertically to that folded edge. That's going to be the very center of the bodice. So to provide a little bit of a visual, the left side is the center of the dress. The top is going to be the very top of the dress, which is a perfectly horizontal line. That triangular shape that I'm pinning right there, that's something called a dart. So the two sides of that triangle are going to be brought together to bring in the waistband, but to allow for some extra room above the triangle for the bust. Little perforations throughout the pattern that you see, and also what I'm sticking my pins in. Those perforations, especially on the triangle, are where I'm supposed to bring the triangle together, where they're supposed to match up to create that dart. The other dots that you see, for example, the ones going across the top, that's for where the straps are going to go. And then the ones along the waistband at the bottom, that's for me to know where to attach parts of the skirt to the bodice. Reason I'm sticking pins in all of those little holes is because I'm going to go back with that Sharpie. You should never use a Sharpie. I told you don't do what I'm doing, but it just happened to be what I had on hand, and the dress is dark anyway, so don't come at me. You should probably use one of those disappearing ink pens or a piece of chalk. Regardless, I'm going to use my Sharpie to put little polka dots all over my fabric so I know exactly where those indicators are. Now let's remove that pattern piece, and we're going to unfold the fabric. Remember, it's folded in half because it's going to be a complete bodice that wraps all the way around, and we're going to stitch the darts or the sides of the triangle. triangle. Now you'll have to forgive me because my great big head is in the way, but what I'm doing right here is now matching up those two dots from one side of the triangle to the other side of the triangle, getting those dots matched up. Then I'm going to pin it in place before stitching together, and I'm going to use a 5/8 inch wide stitch because that's what the pattern calls for. And of course, when you're ready to stitch, that's when you discover your bobbin is empty. So I'm going to go ahead and wind my bobbin real quick before I set to stitching up that bust. Whenever you're stitching something, you want to do a forward stitch, a back stitch, and a forward stitch before taking off down your stitching path. The reason being is because that will help lock your stitches in place. You'll want to do that at the beginning of whatever it is you're sewing and at the end. And I'm using stitches that are 2.5 whatever's wide because I want these stitches to be very strong enough to hold what I'm stitching in place. Now, if you recall, I actually have to do this 4 times. The reason being is because I'm making 2 bodices, one for the front and one for the inside since it's lined. So 2 times 2 is 4. So that's why I'm repeating this process yet again. Forward stitch, back stitch, forward stitch, go to the end, forward stitch, back stitch, forward stitch to lock it in place. And now here you can see one completed one. You'll notice that there's like a little pleat on the left and right hand side. That's where the dart is and the bust goes at the top. Now that I have 2 of the bodices complete, I'm going to pin them together. And now I'm pinning the 2 bodices together with the right sides or the correct sides of the fabric facing each other. What I'm about to do is I'm going to stitch up the side, and then I'm going to stitch across the top until I get to that little indicator right there on the pattern where I'm going to leave a space. That's where the back strap will go. Then I'll stitch a little further until I get to where the front strap will go. Stitch a little more. There's the other front strap and then the other back strap. So then I stitch along the side. I'm trying to be as clear as possible. I hope that makes sense. I'm leaving the bottom open because when I'm finished, that's where I'm going to flip it inside out. And back to the sewing machine. So I'm stitching up the side, and now I'm just going to turn that corner by just lifting up the presser foot, not lifting up the needle. The needle will help anchor it in place when I do that rotation. Then I'm going to stop right here because that's where that back strap is going to go. So you'll see me going forward and back to anchor it in place. My little slicer on the side there is my pair of scissors where I can cut the thread. Then I pick up where I didn't quite leave off because I have to leave that space for the strap. And I'll continue across the top this way, stopping and starting where the straps will go before stitching down the side. Sewing is complete. Let's flip it inside out and see how it looks. This little corner right here is going to be the top of the dress. The opening is where the skirt's going to be. And those little openings that I'm showing there, those are all 4 openings where the straps will go for the dress. Finished up the bodice, and then the next morning I looked at it and realized that I had not taken into consideration the placement of the pattern. I mean, look at it. It's just no good. So even though I didn't want to redo it, I did. I seam ripped the 2, the front and the back apart, got some more fabric, cut and redid the whole thing all over again, and I'm really glad I did. With that part complete, I set about making the straps. So according to the pattern, I was just to cut out, I think it was like 18 by 4.5 inch pieces of fabric, fold that together or fold that in half lengthwise with the like sides of the fabric facing each other, and then stitch. Once the stitching was complete, I used a tool to flip the straps inside out before tucking them into the bodice and then stitching them. With the bodice complete, I'm ready to tackle the skirt. And for that, I'm using 4 of these large rectangles for the skirt. So I'm going to have to stitch 2 together for the front and 2 together for the back. So first order of business, right sides of fabric together, and I'm doing the stitching along that edge right there, that edge that's kind of like pre-woven. It's called a salvage edge. So I'm going to stitch those 2 together for the front and then another 2 together for the back. Now with my super duper long front and back rectangles complete, I decided I wanted to add some pockets. So this is a pattern for a pocket from a completely different dress, but I use it all the time. And I'm going to cut out 4 pieces of fabric for the pocket, 2 pieces for one pocket, 2 pieces for the other. Once those pattern pieces have been cut out, I'm going to stitch one of these shapes to each side of the dress. I'll show you. With like sides together, I'm stitching the pocket to one side of the dress, and I'm only going to stitch down that vertical line. Now I have to do this 4 times, if you remember, because I have 2 pockets, not 4, but there's a front and a back. So I'm going to be stitching right sides together, this pocket, just down that vertical line, and then I'm going to iron all of the pockets open. Let me show you. All right, now that the pockets are ironed open, I'm going to take the front of the dress and I'm going to pin it to the back of the dress. These are giant rectangles, keep in mind. I'm going to pin them in place, and when I stitch, I'm going to go down that vertical line, curve around the pocket, and then go all the way down that vertical line to the bottom of the dress. Here's a closer look of what that looks like on the sewing machine. So I'm going to go straight down. And then when I get to that point where I want to curve around the pocket, I do leave my needle anchored in place so that I can easily pivot, only lifting up the presser foot. That's that little thing that's holding the fabric in place before curving around the pocket. Again, I'm still doing that 5/8 inch stitch, which for me, it helps to have a little Sharpie line on my sewing machine so I can kind of keep that fabric aligned with the correct size that I want. After curving around the pocket, I'm going to do that thing again where I keep the needle anchoring it in place so that I can pivot before stitching all the way straight down to the bottom of the fabric. Are you still with me? Because now what we have the great pleasure of doing is taking all of this fabric and creating a hem so that it's not all fraying and coming apart at the bottom of the dress. So what I did at film was me sitting at the ironing board, folding the fabric over not once, but twice so that I could, in a time-lapse kind of fashion, plow right through the sewing machine with that hem. I think I had to change that bobbin like 3 different times. Now that that part is complete, we're going to go back up to the top being where it's going to be attached to the bodice. And now I'm going to gather. We are gathered here today to gather all of this fabric. Gathering means we're going to crunch it all together so that we can stick it into the waistband of the bodice. So I've now switched my stitch length from 2.5, which is what I use for the hem and all that other jazz, to a 5. And the 5 is what's called a basting stitch. A basting stitch is sometimes used as a temporary stitch, and it's also used in this case when it comes to gathering, because with a basting stitch, when you tug on the end of the thread, it will pull or gather the fabric together. So now I have to do that not once, but twice. I'm going to create 2 lines of basting at the top of the fabric for the waistband. Now with right sides together, I have the bodice and the skirt pinned together. I've already went ahead and gathered one section of the skirt. So let me show you how it's done. It's kind of like if you imagine a drawstring bag where you pull on the strings and it draws the bag closed. That's essentially what we're doing here, except we're trying to draw that giant piece of fabric into, wait for it, this little tiny section of the waist. So I'm just going to grab 2 of the strings and I'm going to start gently tugging, because what I don't want to do is pull too hard and accidentally break the thread. So I'm going to find 2 that are either on the top, 2 of the strings that are on the top, or 2 that are on the bottom. And then I'm going to start pulling. And as you're pulling, you want to kind of move the gathers down as you go, because you want them to all be evenly spaced. What I did was I pinned the skirt and the bodice together in 4 sections. And I also did my basting stitch that way. I didn't baste all the way across the whole thing. I did it in 4 sections. That way, when I gather, it makes my life a little bit, but not a whole lot easier, because I don't have to keep shimmying all those gathers all the way down to the one side of the skirt, but just in these 4 little sections. Once all of this gathering is done and it's all pinned together, then I'm going to stitch. I have to stitch through all those gathers, and that's going to connect the bodice to the skirt. And so here's a little bit of what it looks like once all of that fabric has been gathered and attached to the bodice before it's stitched through the sewing machine. It's a pretty heavy beast. That's a whole lot of fabric. And then let's take a look at the after. So now the bodice is connected to the gathered skirt at the bottom. The only thing missing is the zipper, which I totally messed up. And I'm going to save that for another video, because I think this is a good place to stop. Thanks for joining me on this stitched adventure. Toodles!